The fluorescent lights of Children's Medical Center hummed their endless tune at 3 in the morning, casting harsh shadows across polished linoleum that never quite stayed clean. In these quiet hours, when the world outside slept peacefully, Marcus Rivera pushed his cart down the empty corridors with the methodical rhythm of someone who understood that dignity lived in details. His uniform, navy blue and worn soft from countless washes, bore a small embroidered patch above the breast pocket. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A child's drawing of a rainbow, carefully stitched by 8-year-old Sophia during one of their late-night homework sessions at the kitchen table of their studio apartment. The wheels of his cleaning cart squeaked slightly as he turned the corner toward the pediatric wing. The sound, once grating to his ears, had become as familiar as his own breathing. 3 years of night shifts had taught him to find comfort in the hospital's nocturnal symphony. The distant beeping of monitors, the soft whoosh of ventilators, the gentle padding of nurses' shoes on the polished floors. Each sound told a story of life persisting, of hope refusing to surrender even in the darkest hours. Marcus paused outside room 314, as he did every night. Through the partially open door, he could see the outline of a small figure beneath white hospital blankets. 8-year-old Timothy Chen had been fighting leukemia for 6 months now, and his room had become a universe unto itself. The walls were covered with drawings from his 3rd-grade class, get-well cards from neighbors he'd never met, and photographs of a golden retriever named Buster, who waited patiently at home for his best friend's return. The boy's parents took shifts staying with him, but tonight was Wednesday, which meant both Dr. Chen and Mrs. Chen were attending their weekly support group meeting down the hall. Marcus had learned their schedule not through any official capacity, but through the quiet observation that came naturally to those who lived on the margins. He saw patterns others missed, noticed the small details that revealed the deeper currents of human experience. As he began mopping the hallway outside Timothy's room, Marcus caught sight of movement through the doorway. The boy was sitting up in bed, his bald head catching the pale light from the hallway. His shoulders shook with silent sobs, and Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he witnessed suffering he couldn't fix. This was the burden of the invisible worker, the cleaner who moved through spaces of pain and healing but was never quite part of either world. Marcus had learned long ago that his position came with unspoken rules. He was to clean efficiently and quietly, to remain unnoticed, to respect the boundary between staff and support personnel. But some nights, those rules felt less important than the simple human recognition that suffering deserved acknowledgement, that no child should cry alone in the dark. He knocked gently on the doorframe, a sound barely louder than a whisper. Timothy looked up, his eyes wide and startled in the dim light. The boy had grown accustomed to Marcus's presence over the months, had even waved a few times when their schedules intersected. But this was the first time they had been alone together, the first time the careful distance between them had the opportunity to close. "Hey there, buddy," Marcus said softly, leaning his mop against the doorframe. "Everything okay?" Timothy wiped his nose with the back of his hand, a gesture so achingly normal that it reminded Marcus of his own daughter during her difficult nights. "I can't sleep," the boy whispered. "My stomach hurts and I keep thinking about things." Marcus stepped into the room, his movements careful and deliberate. He had no medical training, no official reason to be there, but he understood pain in ways that couldn't be taught in textbooks. "What kind of things?" "Scary things," Timothy said, his voice small and uncertain. "Like, what if I don't get better? What if Buster forgets me? What if my mom and dad get too tired to keep visiting?" The questions hung in the air like smoke, and Marcus felt the weight of them settle around his shoulders. These were the fears that lived in the spaces between medical procedures, the anxieties that bloomed in the quiet hours when protective adult voices weren't there to provide reassurance. He thought of Sophia, sleeping peacefully in their apartment across town, and felt a surge of protectiveness for this brave boy who was fighting battles no child should face. "Those are big worries for someone your age," Marcus said, settling into the chair beside Timothy's bed. "But you know what I think? I think Buster is probably dreaming about you right now. And your parents, they're not getting tired of visiting. They're getting stronger because loving you gives them superpowers." Timothy managed a small smile at this, and Marcus felt something ease in his chest. This was familiar territory, the gentle navigation of childhood fears that he practiced nightly with his own daughter. But here, in this sterile room filled with medical equipment, the stakes felt different, more urgent. "My dad used to play piano for me when I couldn't sleep," Timothy said suddenly. "But his hands shake now when he's tired, and he says he can't remember the songs anymore." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. In the corner of the room sat an old upright piano, donated by a local music store, and wheeled in months ago when Timothy first expressed interest in music therapy. It had sat silent ever since, gathering dust and serving as little more than a surface for get-well cards and flower arrangements. The sight of it had always stirred something restless in Marcus, a longing he kept carefully buried beneath layers of practical responsibility. "What kind of songs did he play?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Lullabies, mostly, and sometimes classical stuff. He went to music school before he became a doctor." Timothy's eyes brightened slightly. He said music was medicine for the soul, but then he became a real doctor to fix people's bodies instead. Marcus nodded, understanding more than the boy could know. He looked at the piano again, its black surface reflecting the dim light from the hallway. His fingers twitched involuntarily, muscle memory stirring after years of careful suppression. Before Sophia was born, before Anna died, before the world collapsed and reformed around the simple necessity of survival, Marcus had lived in a different universe entirely. A universe where music wasn't just possible, but essential, where his hands moved across keys with the fluidity of water, where the language of melody was as natural as breathing. "Do you think," Timothy said hesitantly, "do you think you might know any songs?" The question hung between them like a bridge Marcus could choose to cross or leave standing. He thought of his supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, who enforced rules with military precision. He thought of the strict boundaries that separated hospital staff from support personnel, the invisible lines that kept people like him in their designated places. He thought of the risk, the potential consequences, the way his job could disappear with a single complaint. But then he looked at Timothy's face, pale and hopeful in the dim light, and felt the weight of a different kind of responsibility. This was a dying child asking for comfort, and Marcus had the power to provide it. The rest was just bureaucracy, just the artificial structures that adults built to maintain order and control. What mattered was this moment, this boy, this chance to ease suffering in whatever small way he could. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I might know a few," Marcus said quietly, rising from the chair. He approached the piano with the reverence of someone returning to a sacred space after a long exile. The bench was covered with a stack of medical magazines, which he moved carefully to the windowsill. As he lifted the keyboard cover, the familiar scent of aged wood and old ivory filled his nostrils, carrying with it a flood of memories he had spent years learning to contain. The keys were slightly out of tune, their surfaces worn smooth by countless fingers over the years. Marcus pressed middle C, and the note rang out clear and honest in the quiet room. It was a sound that seemed to expand the space around them, to push back the walls and create room for possibility. Timothy's eyes widened as Marcus settled onto the bench, his posture automatically adjusting to accommodate the instrument's dimensions. "You really do know how to play." Marcus smiled, his hands finding their way to the keys with muscle memory that transcended the years of silence. "I used to," he said simply. He began with something gentle, a melody that emerged from some deep reservoir of half-remembered lullabies and classical fragments. It wasn't any specific piece, but rather a conversation between his hands and the instrument, a rediscovery of the language they had once shared. The music floated through the room like candlelight, soft and warm and infinitely comforting. Timothy leaned back against his pillows, his eyes fluttering closed as the melody washed over him. The tension in his small shoulders began to ease, and his breathing grew deeper and more regular. Marcus watched the transformation with wonder, remembering how music had once possessed this same power in his own life, this ability to reach past words and touch something essential in the human spirit. As he played, Marcus felt the walls he had built around this part of himself beginning to crumble. For 3 years, he had been Marcus the night cleaner, Marcus the single father, Marcus the man who lived in the practical world of schedules and responsibilities and carefully managed expectations. But sitting at this piano, watching a sick child find peace in the music flowing from his fingers, he remembered who he had been before survival became his full-time occupation. The melody evolved, growing slightly more complex as his confidence returned. His left hand found a gentle bass pattern, while his right hand explored variations on the theme. It was improvisation of the purest kind, music born from the intersection of technical skill and emotional necessity. Every note was chosen not for its theoretical correctness, but for its ability to provide comfort, to create a space where fear could be temporarily set aside. Through the open door, Marcus became aware of movement in the hallway. A nurse had paused in her rounds, drawn by the unexpected sound of music echoing through the pediatric wing. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her face soft with surprise and something that might have been recognition. Then she smiled and continued on her way, understanding instinctively that she was witnessing something important, something that shouldn't be interrupted. Other doors began to open quietly along the hallway. Parents who couldn't sleep, keeping vigil beside their children's beds, stepped into the corridor to investigate the source of the gentle music. They found themselves drawn not just by curiosity but by a deeper need, the universal human hunger for beauty in places where beauty seemed impossible. Marcus was unaware of his growing audience, lost in the conversation between his hands and the keys. The music had taken on a life of its own, flowing through him rather than from him. He thought of Anna, his wife, who had believed in his talent with fierce conviction even when he couldn't see it himself. She had been a music teacher at the elementary school where they met, and she had understood the language of melody in ways that went beyond technical proficiency. The memory of her voice came back to him as he played, her gentle encouragement during the long nights when he practiced for auditions that seemed increasingly impossible to pass. She had never doubted that music was his calling, never suggested that he should consider more practical alternatives. Even when Sophia was born and financial pressures mounted, Anna had insisted that his music wasn't a luxury but a necessity, something the world needed from him. But Anna had been taken by a drunk driver on her way home from a parent-teacher conference, and with her death, Marcus's belief in the possibility of a musical life had died as well. Suddenly, he was alone with an infant daughter, no savings, no family support, and a degree in music performance that seemed to qualify him for nothing in the real world. The piano had become a reminder of loss rather than possibility, and he had chosen silence over the risk of additional pain. Now sitting in this hospital room with Timothy breathing peacefully beside him, Marcus felt the first stirrings of something he had thought was gone forever. Not hope exactly, but something more tentative and fragile. The recognition that music still lived inside him, that the years of silence hadn't destroyed it, but merely hidden it beneath layers of protective numbness. The melody began to shift, incorporating fragments of pieces he had once performed in recitals and competitions. A phrase from a Chopin nocturne, transformed and gentled. A passage from a Bach invention, simplified and warmed. These were pieces that had once defined his identity as a musician, but now they served a different purpose. They were gifts offered freely, without expectation of recognition or reward. Timothy's breathing had grown slow and regular, but his eyes remained open, watching Marcus's hands move across the keys with fascination. "My dad never played like that," he whispered. "It's like the piano is singing." Marcus smiled without breaking the flow of the music. "That's the idea," he said softly. "Every instrument has a voice. You just have to know how to listen for it. Will you teach me sometime?" Timothy asked. "I mean, if I get better?" The question carried so much weight that Marcus felt his hands falter slightly on the keys. Here was a child facing an uncertain future, still finding room for dreams and possibilities. The courage of it was staggering, and Marcus felt humbled by the resilience of the human spirit as it manifested in this brave boy. "When you get better," Marcus said firmly, correcting the conditional nature of Timothy's question. "And yes, I'd be honored to teach you." The commitment surprised him, even as he made it. He had no idea what that promise might mean, how it could be fulfilled given the circumstances of their respective lives. But some promises were made, not because they were practical, but because they were necessary, because the act of making them affirmed something essential about hope and human connection. As the music continued, Marcus became aware that the hallway outside had grown quiet in a different way. The usual sounds of the hospital were still there, but they seemed muted, as if the entire pediatric wing was holding its breath to listen. He couldn't see his audience, but he could feel their presence, the weight of attention that came when music touched something universal in the human experience. He thought of Sophia, sleeping in their apartment, while Mrs. Rodriguez from next door kept watch through the thin walls that separated their lives. His daughter had inherited Anna's ear for music, often humming melodies she made up while she colored or played with her toys. But Marcus had never played for her, had never shared this part of himself with the person who mattered most. Fear had made him selfish, had convinced him that protecting his heart was more important than nurturing her natural gifts. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and his hands stilled on the keys for a moment. Timothy looked up, concerned by the sudden silence. "Is everything okay?" the boy asked. Marcus looked at him, this brave child who was fighting for his life while still finding room to worry about others. "Yes," he said quietly. "Everything's going to be okay." He began to play again, but now the music carried a different quality. There was resolution in it, a sense of arrival after a long journey. The melody that emerged was something entirely new, born from this moment and this place, and this recognition that some gifts were too important to keep hidden. It was music that acknowledged pain without being overwhelmed by it, that found beauty in the midst of struggle, that affirmed the possibility of healing even in the darkest places. Outside the room, Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the hallway with tears streaming down her face. She had returned early from the support group meeting, drawn by an intuition that something was different about this night. The music that filled the pediatric wing was unlike anything she had heard before, simultaneously professional in its execution and deeply personal in its emotional impact. She recognized the cleaner who played for her son, had noticed him during his rounds over the past months. But this revelation of hidden talent was staggering, the kind of discovery that challenged assumptions about identity and worth and the invisible hierarchies that shaped daily life in institutional settings. Beside her, her husband, Dr. James Chen, listened with the trained ear of someone who had once aspired to a career in music before choosing the more practical path of medicine. He understood what they were witnessing, the level of skill and artistry that couldn't be faked or imitated. This wasn't a talented amateur playing for a sick child. This was a musician of genuine ability, someone whose hands moved across the keys with the confidence that came only from years of serious study and practice. "How long has he been playing for Timothy?" Dr. Sarah Chen whispered to her husband. "This is the first time," James replied, his voice filled with wonder. "At least the first time I've heard it." They stood together in the hallway, medical professionals who spent their days fighting disease and death, finding themselves transported by music that seemed to make the struggle worthwhile. Around them, other parents and staff members had gathered quietly, creating an impromptu audience for a performance that none of them would ever forget. Inside the room, Marcus continued to play, unaware of the impact his music was having beyond the immediate space he shared with Timothy. The melody had evolved into something that felt like a prayer, a musical expression of all the hopes and fears that lived in this place where life and death intersected daily. It was music that acknowledged suffering without surrendering to it, that found meaning in the act of caring for others, that celebrated the mysterious ways in which beauty could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. Timothy had grown drowsy under the influence of the gentle melody, his eyelids heavy with the peaceful exhaustion that came when fear was temporarily set aside. But he fought sleep, unwilling to let this magical moment end. "Will you play tomorrow night too?" he asked softly. Marcus looked at the boy, considering the implications of the question. Tomorrow night would bring new challenges, new risks, new opportunities for both connection and consequence. He thought of Mrs. Patterson and the rules that governed his employment, of the careful boundaries that kept hospital operations running smoothly. But he also thought of Timothy's peaceful face, of the gathering audience in the hallway, of the way music had the power to heal wounds that medicine couldn't touch. "If you want me to," he said simply. Timothy smiled, his eyes finally closing as sleep began to claim him. "I want you to," he whispered. As the boy drifted off, Marcus allowed the music to fade gradually, each note growing softer until silence reclaimed the room. But it was a different kind of silence now, filled with the echo of melody and the promise of return. He sat at the piano for a moment longer, his hands resting on the keys, feeling the weight of what had just occurred. When he finally stood and turned toward the door, he was startled to find Dr. Chen standing in the doorway, her face wet with tears. She stepped into the room quietly, her movements careful not to disturb her sleeping son. "That was beautiful," she said softly. "I had no idea you were a musician." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, the familiar discomfort that came when his carefully maintained invisibility was unexpectedly breached. "I'm not," he said automatically. "I mean, I used to be. I just thought Timothy might like some music." Dr. Chen studied his face with the intensity of someone trained to read between the lines, to understand what patients couldn't or wouldn't say directly. "What you just played," she said carefully, "that wasn't amateur music. That was the kind of playing that takes years to develop." Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention and unsure how to navigate this conversation. "It was a long time ago," he said, "before Sophia was born, before everything changed."
"Sophia is your daughter?"
"Yes, she's 8. She stays with our neighbor when I work nights." Dr. Chen nodded, understanding beginning to dawn in her expression. She saw now the sacrifice that his presence here represented, the way he balanced single parenthood with the necessity of earning a living wage. The night shift at the hospital paid better than day work, but it meant sleeping during the day while Sophia was at school and spending his evenings helping her with homework before coming to work. It was a life built around the needs of others, with little room for personal dreams or aspirations. "Have you ever considered," she said hesitantly, "returning to music professionally?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Marcus wasn't sure he was ready to examine. For 3 years, he had built his identity around being exactly what he appeared to be, a responsible father doing honest work to support his family. The idea that he might be something more, that his hidden talents might have value in the world, was both thrilling and terrifying. "It's not practical," he said finally. "I have responsibilities." Dr. Chen understood the weight of responsibilities, the way they could shape and limit choices in ways that were both necessary and heartbreaking. But she also understood the waste of talent, the tragedy that occurred when gifts went unused and unrecognized. As a doctor, she had seen too many lives diminished by circumstances beyond individual control, and she felt a professional obligation to address suffering wherever she encountered it. "What if," she said slowly, "there was a way to do both? To honor your responsibilities and your gifts?" Marcus looked at her with skepticism, his experience having taught him to be wary of promises that seemed too good to be true. But there was something in her expression, a sincerity that suggested she wasn't offering false hope, but rather a genuine possibility he had never considered. Before he could respond, a new voice spoke from the hallway. "Excuse me, is this where the music was coming from?" They turned to see a woman in her 50s standing in the doorway, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and her clothes suggesting both taste and means. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to, but her expression was gentle and curious rather than demanding. "I'm sorry," Dr. Chen said. "I'm not sure what you mean." The woman smiled. "I was visiting my granddaughter on the 4th floor when I heard piano music. The whole hospital seemed to stop and listen. I followed the sound down here." She looked at Marcus with interest. "Was that you playing?" Marcus nodded reluctantly, still uncomfortable with the attention, but recognizing that denial would be pointless. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Margaret Walsh," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm on the board of directors here at Children's Medical Center, and I have to say, what I heard tonight was extraordinary." The introduction changed the dynamics of the conversation in ways that Marcus couldn't fully process. A board member represented authority and influence, the kind of institutional power that could either create opportunities or eliminate them entirely. He shook her hand cautiously, unsure whether this encounter would prove beneficial or catastrophic to his carefully maintained existence. "I don't want to cause any trouble," he said quickly. "I was just trying to help Timothy sleep." Margaret Walsh's expression softened. "You're not in trouble," she said gently. "Quite the opposite. What you did tonight, the gift you shared, that's exactly the kind of healing we're trying to foster here. Music therapy is a growing field, but what I heard wasn't just therapeutic. It was artistically exceptional." She paused, studying his face with the attention of someone making an important decision. "Would you be willing to meet with me sometime this week? I'd like to discuss some possibilities that might interest you." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to someone who had given up hope of rescue. Marcus felt his heart race with a mixture of excitement and terror, the way dreams always felt when they suddenly seemed possible rather than merely wishful thinking. "I work nights," he said automatically, his practical mind already calculating the logistics of such a meeting. "I can accommodate your schedule," Margaret assured him. "This is important." Dr. Chen watched this exchange with growing excitement, understanding that she was witnessing the kind of serendipitous connection that could change lives. "Marcus," she said softly, "I think you should listen to what Mrs. Walsh has to say." Marcus looked between the two women, these representatives of a world he had once hoped to inhabit but had long since accepted was beyond his reach. Timothy slept peacefully in his hospital bed, the music having given him the rest he needed to continue his fight. The piano sat silent in the corner, but its presence felt different now, charged with possibility rather than weighted with loss. "Okay," he said finally. "I'd like to hear what you have in mind." Margaret Walsh smiled, and in that smile, Marcus glimpsed the first hint of a future he had never dared to imagine. A future where his gifts might serve a larger purpose, where the music that lived inside him could find expression in ways that honored both his talents and his responsibilities. As he gathered his cleaning supplies and prepared to continue his rounds, Marcus felt the weight of transformation beginning to settle around his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities, but tonight had already changed everything. Tonight, a dying child had asked for comfort, and in providing it, Marcus had rediscovered a part of himself he thought was lost forever. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless tune, but now their sound seemed different, less harsh and more rhythmic, like a percussion section keeping time for the symphony of life that played out in these corridors every night. Marcus pushed his cart down the hallway, but his step was lighter now, his movement more purposeful. Behind him, Timothy slept peacefully, his breathing steady and calm. Dr. Chen sat in the chair beside his bed, her hand resting gently on his forehead, her own heart filled with gratitude for the unexpected gift that had been offered to her son. And somewhere in the building, Margaret Walsh was already making phone calls, setting in motion a series of events that would transform not just Marcus's life, but the lives of countless children who would benefit from the healing power of music in the months and years to come. The night shift continued, but everything had changed. In the space of an hour, a hospital cleaner had become a musician again. A dying child had found peace, and the rigid boundaries that separated different worlds had proven more permeable than anyone had dared to hope. Music had worked its ancient magic, reminding everyone present that beauty could emerge from the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the most extraordinary gifts came wrapped in the most ordinary packages. As Marcus completed his rounds that night, he found himself humming softly under his breath, melodies that seemed to spring from nowhere and everywhere at once. For the first time in 3 years, the future felt like a song waiting to be played, rather than a burden waiting to be borne. And somewhere in the distance, just beyond the edge of hearing, the faint sound of applause seemed to echo through the corridors, a promise of recognition yet to come. The coffee in the hospital cafeteria tasted like burnt aluminum, but Marcus Rivera sipped it anyway, trying to calm the nervous energy that had kept him awake all day. Across from him sat Margaret Walsh, her silver hair catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the large windows overlooking the hospital courtyard. She had insisted on meeting during his daughter's school hours, understanding that his time was precious and carefully divided between work and parenting responsibilities. Margaret studied the manila folder spread between them on the small table, its contents representing a life Marcus had never expected anyone to examine so closely. His old resume from music school, performance programs from concerts he'd given years ago, letters of recommendation from professors who probably didn't remember his name anymore. Dr. Chen had helped him gather these documents, suggesting that Margaret would want to see proof of his musical background. "Your audition tape for the Cleveland Orchestra Fellowship," Margaret said, holding up a CD that looked ancient in the age of streaming music. "That was only 6 years ago. You made it to the final round." Marcus nodded, the memory still sharp despite the years that had passed. He remembered the pressure of that audition, the way his hands had trembled slightly as he approached the piano in the concert hall. Anna had been 8 months pregnant with Sophia then, her belly round and perfect as she sat in the audience offering silent encouragement. The rejection letter had arrived 3 days after Sophia was born, and somehow it had felt like the universe delivering a clear message about priorities and practical realities. "I came close to a lot of things back then," Marcus said quietly. "But close doesn't pay for diapers or medical bills." Margaret's expression softened with understanding. She had raised 3 children of her own, had navigated the impossible balance between dreams and responsibilities that defined parenthood. But she had also served on countless boards and committees, had seen how talent could be nurtured and developed even under challenging circumstances. "Tell me about your daughter," she said, closing the folder and giving him her full attention. Marcus's face transformed when he spoke about Sophia, the way it always did when he shifted from discussing his own struggles to celebrating his child's potential. "She's 8, brilliant, curious about everything. She loves music, always humming these little songs she makes up. Her teacher says she's reading at a 6th grade level already. Does she know about your musical background?" The question hit harder than Marcus had expected. He looked down at his hands, calloused from 3 years of cleaning work, but still carrying the muscle memory of countless hours at the piano. "Not really. I mean, she knows I can play a little, but I've never shown her how much. I didn't want her to think that music was something you could rely on to make a living." Margaret leaned forward, her voice gentle but direct. "What if it could be?" Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it quickly, expecting a routine check-in from Mrs. Rodriguez about Sophia's after-school schedule. Instead, he saw a message that made his blood run cold. Timothy Chen's condition has deteriorated. He's asking for you. Can you come in early tonight? Dr. Sarah Chen. Marcus felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. In the 3 days since their first musical encounter, he had played for Timothy each night, watching the boy's strength ebb and flow like an uncertain tide. The music had become a ritual for both of them, a bridge between fear and hope that neither wanted to cross alone. But this message carried an urgency that suggested their time might be running out. "I have to go," Marcus said, standing abruptly and gathering the scattered documents. "Timothy, the boy I've been playing for, he's gotten worse." Margaret rose as well, her movements swift and decisive. "I'll come with you." Marcus paused, surprised by her offer. "You don't have to do that. I know you're busy, and this isn't really your responsibility." "Marcus," Margaret said firmly, "nothing is more important than this. That child has been fighting for his life, and you've been giving him something that medicine can't provide. If he's asking for you now, then that's exactly where we both need to be." They rode the elevator to the pediatric wing in silence, the weight of unfinished conversations settling between them. Marcus thought about the offer Margaret had begun to outline before the interruption, something about a music therapy position that could be created specifically for him. It had seemed like a fantasy, too good to be true, but her presence beside him now suggested a level of commitment that went beyond polite interest. The pediatric wing felt different during the day shift, busier and more chaotic than the quiet sanctuary Marcus knew from his nighttime rounds. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency, doctors consulted in hushed tones, and the sounds of life and healing filled the corridors with an energy that was both hopeful and heartbreaking. They found Dr. Chen waiting outside Timothy's room, her expression grave but not hopeless. "His fever spiked this morning," she explained quietly. "We're managing it, but he's been asking for the piano man every hour. He won't rest until he hears you play." Through the doorway, Marcus could see Timothy propped up against a mountain of pillows, his face pale but alert. The boy's eyes lit up when he spotted Marcus in the hallway, and a smile broke across his features like sunrise after a long night. "You came," Timothy said weakly as Marcus entered the room. "I thought maybe you only worked at night." "I work whenever you need me," Marcus replied, settling into the familiar chair beside the piano. "How are you feeling, buddy?" "Tired," Timothy admitted, but not the sleepy kind of tired. The kind where everything hurts and you just want it to stop. Marcus understood that exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness that came from fighting battles that seemed too big for the person fighting them. He had felt it during the months after Anna's death, when grief and responsibility had combined to create a weight that threatened to crush everything he valued most. "What would you like to hear today?" Marcus asked, his hands already moving toward the keys. "Something brave," Timothy said without hesitation. "Something that sounds like not giving up." The request hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than any 8-year-old should be asked to bear. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came when children spoke truths that adults spent lifetimes learning to avoid. He looked at the piano, then at Timothy, then at the small audience that had gathered in the doorway. Dr. Chen stood with her husband, both of them holding hands like teenagers facing an uncertain future together. Margaret Walsh had positioned herself near the back of the room, her phone silenced and her attention completely focused on the scene unfolding before her. And scattered throughout the hallway, Marcus could see other patients and families who had been drawn by word of his presence. People seeking whatever comfort music might provide in this place, where comfort was often in short supply. Marcus began with a single note, strong and clear and unwavering. It was the opening of a piece he had learned in graduate school, a composition by a contemporary American composer who specialized in music that acknowledged darkness without surrendering to it. The melody that emerged was complex but accessible, technically demanding but emotionally direct. It was music that sounded exactly like not giving up. As he played, Marcus felt something shift in his relationship with the instrument. For 3 years, he had approached the piano as a guilty pleasure, a secret indulgence that he could only allow himself in moments of complete privacy. But here, playing for Timothy and the growing crowd of listeners, the music became something else entirely. It became a form of service, a way of using his gifts to meet needs that went beyond his own desires for recognition or artistic fulfillment. The composition built gradually, adding layers of complexity as Marcus's confidence grew. His left hand established a rhythmic foundation that suggested forward momentum, while his right hand explored melodic variations that spoke of resilience and determination. It was music that acknowledged struggle without being overwhelmed by it, that found beauty in the act of persisting despite overwhelming odds. Timothy's breathing had steadied as the music filled the room, his pain not eliminated, but somehow made more bearable by the knowledge that he wasn't facing it alone. His parents stood transfixed, watching their son find peace in the hands of a man they barely knew, but had come to trust completely. Around them, the informal audience had grown to include nurses, who should have been attending to other duties, doctors who had finished their rounds but couldn't bring themselves to leave, and families who understood that they were witnessing something rare and precious. Margaret Walsh watched Marcus play with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades evaluating musical talent. She recognized the technical proficiency that came only from years of serious study, but more importantly, she saw the emotional intelligence that separated good musicians from great ones. This wasn't just skilled performance, it was musical healing of the highest order. As the piece reached its climax, Marcus allowed himself to push the boundaries of what he thought the old piano could handle. His hands moved across the keys with increasing velocity and precision, creating cascades of sound that seemed to transform the sterile hospital room into a concert hall. The music demanded attention, not through volume, but through sheer emotional intensity, each note carrying the weight of lived experience and hard-won wisdom. And then, in a moment that would be remembered by everyone present, Timothy began to hum along. His voice was weak and uncertain, but it carried the melody with perfect pitch and intuitive musicality. The sound of a dying child, finding the strength to make music of his own, created a silence that was deeper than mere absence of noise. It was the silence of recognition, of witnessing something sacred in the midst of ordinary suffering. Marcus heard Timothy's voice and felt his own technique dissolve into something more elemental. This was no longer about demonstrating skill or providing comfort. It had become a conversation between two musicians who understood each other across the vast differences in their experience and circumstance. He began to simplify the accompaniment, creating space for Timothy's voice to emerge more clearly. What followed was improvisation of the purest kind, a musical dialogue between a trained pianist and an untrained child who possessed something that couldn't be taught in any conservatory. Timothy's humming grew stronger as Marcus provided harmonic support, and together they created something that was simultaneously heartbreaking and transcendent. Dr. Chen wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her son discover his own musical voice. She had spent months focused on blood counts and treatment protocols, fighting a disease that threatened to define her child's entire existence. But in this moment, Timothy wasn't a patient or a victim. He was a musician, collaborating with another musician to create beauty in the face of impossible circumstances. The improvisation continued for nearly 10 minutes, with Marcus and Timothy trading melodic phrases like old friends sharing stories. Sometimes Timothy would hum a fragment of melody that Marcus would develop and return in harmonic variations. Other times, Marcus would establish a simple theme that Timothy would embellish with his own intuitive sense of musical phrasing. Margaret Walsh found herself thinking about the grant applications and funding proposals that crossed her desk every month. Requests for money to support programs that promised to change lives and heal communities. Most of them were well-intentioned but abstract, filled with theoretical frameworks and projected outcomes that sounded impressive but rarely delivered transformational results. What she was witnessing now was proof of concept more powerful than any research study or statistical analysis. As the musical conversation began to wind down, Marcus brought the volume back to a whisper, allowing Timothy's voice to take the lead in determining when their collaboration would end. The boy's humming grew softer and more intermittent, fatigue finally claiming his strength despite his obvious desire to continue. Finally, he let the melody trail off into silence, leaving only the sound of his slightly labored breathing and the distant hum of hospital machinery. "That was beautiful, Timothy," Marcus said softly. "You have a gift." Timothy smiled weakly, but his eyes were bright with accomplishment. "Did I really sound okay? I've never sung with a real musician before." "You sounded like you were born to make music," Marcus assured him. "And I am honored to have played with you." The room remained quiet for several moments, everyone present processing what they had just experienced. Then Margaret Walsh stepped forward, her expression thoughtful and determined. "Marcus," she said, "I think we need to continue our conversation. But first I'd like to make a phone call." She moved into the hallway, and Marcus could see her speaking intently with someone, her gestures animated and urgent. Timothy dozed fitfully in his bed, exhausted by the effort of singing, but peaceful in a way that medication alone couldn't provide. Dr. Chen approached the piano bench where Marcus still sat. "I've never seen him like that," she said quietly. "The music, the singing, it's like he became himself again, instead of just being a patient." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Music has a way of reminding us who we are underneath everything else. It cuts through all the noise and gets to the essential part of being human. "Is that why you stopped playing professionally? Because it cut too deep?" The question was perceptive and painful in its accuracy. Marcus looked at his hands, still positioned over the keys, as if reluctant to break the connection with the instrument. "After Anna died, everything reminded me of loss. Music most of all, because it had been such a big part of what we shared. I thought it would be easier to just put it away and focus on practical things. But it didn't go away, did it?" "No," Marcus admitted. "It just got quieter, like a radio playing in another room that you can't quite hear but know is there." Dr. Chen sat down in the chair beside Timothy's bed, watching her son sleep. James used to play piano before medical school. He was quite good, but he convinced himself that medicine was more important, more useful to the world. Now he works 16-hour days saving lives, but he's forgotten how to save his own soul. The observation hung between them, carrying implications that neither fully articulated but both understood. The choice between artistic fulfillment and practical responsibility was one that countless people faced, usually resolving it by choosing security over creativity. But Marcus's presence here, his ability to provide healing through music that complemented rather than competed with medical treatment, suggested that the choice might be a false one. Margaret Walsh returned from her phone call, her expression excited but controlled. "Marcus, I've just spoken with Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, the director of music therapy at Julliard. She's heard about what's happening here and she wants to meet with you." Marcus felt his world shift again, the way it had been shifting constantly since that first night when Timothy couldn't sleep. Julliard, the music school? They have a graduate program in music therapy that's specifically designed for working musicians who want to combine performance skills with therapeutic applications. Dr. Hartman thinks you might be exactly what they're looking for. The offer was so far beyond anything Marcus had dared to imagine that he couldn't immediately process its implications. Julliard represented the pinnacle of musical education, the kind of institution that had always seemed as distant and unreachable as the moon. The idea that they might be interested in him, a hospital cleaner who played piano for sick children, was almost too surreal to believe. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "How would someone like Dr. Hartman even know about me?" Margaret smiled. "I may have sent her a video of you playing last night. With your permission, of course, which I'm asking for retroactively." Marcus's mind raced with questions and concerns. The practical obstacles seemed insurmountable: tuition costs, living expenses, childcare arrangements for Sophia. Even if the opportunity was real, which still seemed doubtful, the logistics of pursuing it while maintaining his responsibilities as a single father appeared impossible. "I can't afford Julliard," he said simply. "And I can't move to New York with Sophia. She's settled here. She has friends and a school she loves." "What if you didn't have to move?" Margaret asked. "What if the program could be adapted to accommodate your circumstances?" Before Marcus could respond, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Through the doorway, they could see a group of people approaching Timothy's room, led by a woman in her 50s, wearing a tailored coat and carrying a professional-looking camera bag. Behind her walked a younger man with recording equipment and a hospital administrator Marcus recognized but had never spoken to directly. "That's Dr. Hartman," Margaret said, rising to meet the new arrivals. "She flew in from New York this afternoon." Marcus felt panic rise in his throat. This was happening too fast, spinning beyond his control, in ways that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained equilibrium. He looked at Timothy, still sleeping peacefully after their musical collaboration, and felt the weight of responsibility settle around his shoulders. Whatever was happening, whoever these people were, his primary obligation was to this sick child who had trusted him with his fears and found comfort in their shared music. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman entered the room with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to evaluating talent in high-pressure situations. She was smaller than Marcus had expected, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her attention went immediately to the piano, then to Marcus, then to Timothy sleeping in the hospital bed. "You must be Marcus," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Beth Hartman from Julliard. Margaret tells me you've been providing music therapy for patients here." "I wouldn't call it therapy," Marcus said, shaking her hand cautiously. "I just play piano for Timothy when he can't sleep." Dr. Hartman smiled at his modesty, recognizing the deflection that often accompanied genuine talent. "May I hear you play something?" The request was simple, but loaded with implications that Marcus couldn't fully calculate. This woman represented an opportunity that could change everything about his life and Sophia's future, but it also represented risk on a scale he had spent 3 years learning to avoid. He looked at Timothy, at Dr. Chen, at Margaret Walsh, all of them waiting for his response. "Timothy's sleeping," he said quietly. "I don't want to disturb him." "Then play quietly," Dr. Hartman suggested. "Something gentle." Marcus approached the piano with the heightened awareness that came when performance carried consequences beyond mere artistic satisfaction. He thought about all the auditions he had failed, all the opportunities that had slipped away despite his best efforts. But he also thought about Timothy, humming along with perfect pitch, about the peace that had settled over the boy's face when music filled the room with something beyond fear and pain. He began with a simple melody, something he had composed years ago during a particularly difficult period in his marriage when words had failed to bridge the distance between him and Anna. It was music, born from the desire to communicate across emotional barriers, to find connection when everything else felt impossible. The piece was technically modest, but emotionally sophisticated, requiring more interpretive skill than mechanical precision. As he played, Marcus became aware that Dr. Hartman was listening with the focused attention of someone trained to hear beneath the surface of performance. She wasn't just evaluating his technical abilities, but assessing his musical intelligence, his capacity for emotional expression, his potential for growth and development as both performer and healer. The melody evolved as Marcus's confidence grew, incorporating elements of improvisation that reflected his recent experiences with Timothy. The music became a conversation between his formal training and his intuitive understanding of what this place needed, between his past aspirations and his present circumstances. It was performance as biography, musical autobiography, that revealed as much about his character as his capabilities. Timothy stirred slightly in his sleep a smile crossing his features as if the music was reaching him even in his dreams. Dr. Chen moved closer to her son's bedside, her expression soft with gratitude for whatever peace Marcus's playing could provide. The informal audience in the hallway had grown again, drawn by word that something significant was happening in room 314. Dr. Hartman listened with increasing excitement, recognizing not just talent, but the kind of mature musicianship that came from lived experience and emotional depth. This wasn't the technical proficiency of a recent conservatory graduate, but the weathered wisdom of someone who had found music again after losing it, who played now not for career advancement, but for the simple necessity of providing comfort to a dying child. As the piece drew to a close, Marcus allowed the final notes to fade gradually, creating space for the silence that followed to carry its own meaning. He sat quietly at the piano, hands resting on the keys, waiting for whatever judgment Dr. Hartman might render. "Extraordinary," she said finally. "Margaret wasn't exaggerating when she described your abilities." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, uncomfortable with praise, but unable to deny the small spark of pride that Dr. Hartman's approval ignited. "Thank you," he said simply. "I'd like to make you an offer," Dr. Hartman continued. "But first, I want you to understand exactly what we're talking about." She opened her bag and withdrew a tablet, scrolling through documents and images that appeared to outline some kind of program or curriculum. "Our music therapy graduate program typically requires 2 years of full-time study in New York. Students learn to apply musical skills in clinical settings, working with patients who have a wide range of medical and psychological needs." Marcus nodded, trying to process information that still seemed too far removed from his reality to be entirely credible. "That sounds incredible, but like I told Margaret, I can't relocate with my daughter. Which is why we're prepared to create something entirely new," Dr. Hartman said. "A pilot program that combines distance learning with intensive residencies and clinical practicum, right here at Children's Medical Center." The offer hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds, one foot planted in the practical necessity of Marcus's current life, and the other reaching toward possibilities he had never dared to imagine. Margaret Walsh watched his face, understanding the internal calculation that was taking place as he weighed opportunity against obligation. "What would that look like practically?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral. Dr. Hartman smiled, recognizing the question as evidence of serious consideration rather than polite skepticism. "You would continue working here at the hospital, but in a formal music therapy capacity rather than as a cleaner. Your salary would reflect your new responsibilities, and Julliard would provide the educational components necessary for professional certification. And Sophia would have access to our preparatory division through online instruction and summer programs. If she's inherited your musical gifts, we want to nurture those as well." The conversation was interrupted by a soft voice from the hospital bed. "Are you talking about music school?" Timothy asked, his eyes open but still heavy with fatigue. Dr. Hartman approached his bedside, her professional demeanor softening as she focused on the young patient. "We're talking about helping Marcus become an official music teacher for children like you who are in the hospital." Timothy's face lit up with excitement, despite his obvious exhaustion. "That would be so cool. He's the best piano player I've ever heard, and he makes up songs just for me." "Is that right?" Dr. Hartman looked back at Marcus with renewed interest. "You've been composing original material for your sessions?" Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with the clinical terminology being applied to what felt like natural conversation. "Timothy tells me what kind of music he needs, and I try to play something that fits. Sometimes that means making it up as I go." "Improvisation and composition are advanced skills," Dr. Hartman observed. "They suggest a level of musical maturity that goes well beyond basic performance ability." She turned back to Timothy, her expression gentle but curious. "Would you like to tell me about the music Marcus plays for you?" Timothy's eyes brightened as he launched into an enthusiastic description of their nightly sessions, his fatigue temporarily forgotten in his excitement to share something that had brought him so much joy. He spoke about lullabies that helped him sleep and brave songs that made him feel strong, about the way Marcus's music seemed to understand exactly what he was feeling without requiring him to explain it in words. As Timothy talked, Dr. Hartman made notes on her tablet, documenting not just the musical elements of what Marcus was providing, but the therapeutic outcomes that were clearly evident in the boy's engagement and emotional state. This was exactly the kind of real-world evidence that supported the expansion of music therapy programs. Proof that musical intervention could provide benefits that complemented traditional medical treatment. Dr. Chen joined the conversation, sharing her observations about her son's improved sleep patterns and reduced anxiety levels since Marcus had begun playing for him. "It's not just Timothy," she added. "The entire pediatric wing has been different since Marcus started playing. Children who were having trouble with treatment compliance are suddenly more cooperative. Parents who were on the edge of breakdown are finding reasons to hope." Margaret Walsh nodded in agreement. "We've had requests from other departments asking if the music therapy could be expanded to include their patients as well. Adult oncology, cardiac rehabilitation, even the emergency department." Marcus listened to this discussion with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. The idea that his simple gesture of comfort for one lonely child could have ripple effects throughout the entire hospital was both gratifying and overwhelming. He thought about all the nights he had walked these corridors as an invisible cleaner, unaware of the suffering and hope that existed just beyond his peripheral vision. The program would start small, Dr. Hartman explained, returning her attention to Marcus. "You would work with a handful of patients initially, learning the formal protocols and documentation requirements while maintaining the intuitive approach that's already proving so effective." "And the education component?" "Online coursework covering music therapy theory, child psychology, medical ethics and clinical methodology, plus quarterly residencies in New York, where you would work with our faculty and observe established programs in action." The logistics were beginning to sound manageable, which somehow made the opportunity more terrifying rather than less. Marcus had spent 3 years building a life around the certainty of limitation, the knowledge that his dreams would always be secondary to his responsibilities. The possibility that he might not have to choose between caring for Sophia and pursuing his musical calling challenged assumptions he had used to structure his entire existence. "I need time to think about this," he said finally, "and I need to talk to Sophia. She deserves to know what's being considered before any decisions are made." Dr. Hartman nodded approvingly. "Of course. This is a significant life change that affects both of you. Take all the time you need." She gathered her materials and prepared to leave, but paused at Timothy's bedside. "It was wonderful to meet you, Timothy. You have excellent taste in piano players." Timothy grinned weakly. "Are you really going to help Marcus become a music teacher?" "I think Marcus is already a music teacher," Dr. Hartman replied. "We're just going to help him become a better one." After the visitors had left, the room settled into a quieter rhythm. Timothy dozed intermittently, his condition stable but still requiring careful monitoring. Dr. Chen remained at his bedside, occasionally checking his temperature and adjusting his medications, but mostly just being present in the way that only parents could be in the face of their child's suffering. Marcus sat at the piano, not playing, but simply maintaining the connection with the instrument that had become so central to his identity over the past week. His mind was spinning with possibilities and concerns, trying to calculate the risks and benefits of a decision that could reshape everything about his future. "What are you thinking?" Dr. Chen asked softly, noting his contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about how quickly things can change," Marcus replied. "A week ago, I was just a guy who mopped floors and tried to stay invisible. Now people are talking about Julliard and music therapy and opportunities I never dreamed were possible. Are you afraid?" The question was direct and insightful, cutting through his surface concerns to address the deeper anxiety that was driving his uncertainty. Marcus considered the question carefully, trying to distinguish between rational caution and irrational fear. Terrified, he admitted. Not of the opportunity itself, but of believing in it too much and then having it disappear. Sophia and I have built a good life around modest expectations. We're happy, we're stable, we have everything we need. Why risk that for something that might not work out? Dr. Chen understood the weight of such decisions, the way that hope could feel like a luxury that responsible parents couldn't afford. But she also understood the cost of playing it safe, the way that unrealized potential could create its own kind of suffering over time. "What would Anna want you to do?" she asked gently. The question hit Marcus like a physical blow, unexpected and devastating in its accuracy. He thought about his wife's unwavering belief in his musical gifts, her insistence that his talents were meant to serve something larger than personal ambition. Anna had never doubted that music was his calling, even when he struggled to see it himself. "She would tell me to trust the music," he said quietly. "She always said that if I listened carefully enough, the music would tell me where I needed to go." "And what is the music telling you now?" Marcus looked at Timothy, sleeping peacefully after their afternoon of musical collaboration. He thought about the boy's natural musicality, the way he had intuitively understood harmonic structures and melodic development, despite having no formal training. There was something profound about that moment of shared creativity, something that suggested possibilities beyond individual achievement or personal satisfaction. "It's telling me that this isn't really about me," he said slowly. "It's about all the children like Timothy who need something that medicine can't provide. It's about using whatever gifts I have to serve something bigger than my own fears and limitations." Dr. Chen smiled, recognizing the shift in his perspective that often preceded important life decisions. "That sounds like the voice of someone who's ready to take a risk for the right reasons." Marcus nodded, feeling something settle into place inside his chest. The fear was still there, but it was balanced now by something stronger. The knowledge that some opportunities were too important to refuse, regardless of the personal cost or uncertainty they might entail. "I think I need to go home and talk to Sophia," he said, rising from the piano bench. "She's been the center of every decision I've made for 3 years. If I'm going to change course now, she needs to be part of that choice." As he gathered his things and prepared to leave, Marcus felt the weight of transformation settling around his shoulders once again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities, but tonight had already changed the trajectory of his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. He paused at Timothy's bedside, gently adjusting the boy's blanket and listening to his steady breathing. In sleep, Timothy looked like any other 8-year-old, peaceful and innocent and full of untapped potential. But Marcus now understood that their connection went beyond the simple comfort he had initially offered. They were both musicians discovering their voices in the face of circumstances that could have silenced them forever. The elevator ride to the ground floor gave Marcus time to process the magnitude of what had occurred. Dr. Hartman's offer represented more than just a career opportunity. It was a chance to integrate his deepest gifts with his most fundamental responsibilities, to build a life that honored both his talents and his duties as a father. As he walked through the hospital lobby toward the parking garage, Marcus found himself humming softly under his breath, melodies that seemed to spring from nowhere and everywhere at once. For the first time in 3 years, the future felt like a symphony waiting to be composed rather than a series of problems waiting to be solved. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to fade into evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Marcus of the stained glass windows in the church where he and Anna had been married. It felt like a sign, a reminder that beauty could emerge from the most ordinary moments if you knew how to look for it. He thought about Sophia, probably finishing her homework at the kitchen table of their small apartment, humming one of her invented songs as she worked through math problems and reading assignments. Soon he would sit beside her and share the incredible news about Julliard and music therapy and the possibility that their modest life might expand in ways neither of them had dared to imagine. The drive home took him through familiar neighborhoods, past the elementary school where Sophia spent her days, and the park where they sometimes played on weekends. These were the landmarks of their carefully constructed life, the geographic boundaries of a world built around security and predictability. But as Marcus navigated the familiar streets, he found himself seeing them differently, as if they had become the opening movement of a much larger composition that was only just beginning to reveal its full scope and potential. By the time he pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex, Marcus had made his decision. Not about the specifics of Dr. Hartman's offer, which would require careful consideration and detailed planning, but about the fundamental question of whether he was ready to trust in possibilities that extended beyond his current limitations. The answer was yes. For Timothy, for Sophia, for Anna's memory, and for the music that had never really left him, but had only been waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges and obstacles that he couldn't yet anticipate. But for the first time in 3 years, uncertainty felt like promise rather than threat, like the opening measures of a song whose ending would be worth whatever risks the journey might require. Sofia Rivera sat at the kitchen table, her math homework spread across the worn laminate surface like a small battlefield of numbers and erasure marks. At 8 years old, she possessed the kind of focused concentration that made her teachers write glowing notes on her report cards. But tonight, her attention kept drifting to the clock on the microwave. Her father usually arrived home from his day sleep around 4 o'clock, and it was already past 5. Mrs. Rodriguez, their elderly neighbor who watched Sophia after school, noticed the girl's restlessness. "Mijo will be here soon," she said gently, using the endearment she applied to both father and daughter. "Sometimes the hospital keeps him longer when they need extra help." Sophia nodded, but continued glancing toward the door. She had inherited her father's musical ear and could usually identify his footsteps on the stairs before his key turned in the lock. The sounds of the apartment building had become a familiar symphony to her. Mrs. Chen, cooking dinner for her large family on the second floor. The college students upstairs playing music too loudly. The old pipes rattling when someone ran hot water. But none of these sounds included her father's reassuring presence. When Marcus finally opened the door, Sophia immediately sensed something different about his energy. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying momentous news, the way people walked when they were trying not to drop something precious and fragile. His eyes held an excitement that he was clearly struggling to contain, mixed with an anxiety that suggested important decisions were waiting to be made. "How was school, sweetheart?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her and examining her homework with genuine interest. This was their daily ritual, the sacred transition from his work world to her school world, a bridge they built together every afternoon. "Good. Mrs. Martinez said I'm reading at a high school level now," Sophia reported with matter-of-fact pride. "And in music class, Mr. Williams asked if anyone in my family plays instruments. I told him you could play piano a little, but I've never actually heard you." The comment hit Marcus with surprising force, highlighting the gap between his hidden talents and his daughter's perception of his capabilities. For 3 years, he had maintained the fiction that music was a minor hobby from his past, unimportant and irrelevant to their current life. But sitting at this kitchen table, looking into Sophia's curious and intelligent eyes, that deception suddenly felt like a betrayal of something fundamental. "What if I told you," Marcus said slowly, "that playing piano isn't just something I can do a little of? What if I told you it was something I used to do professionally before you were born?" Sophia's eyes widened with the particular excitement that children display when adults reveal previously unknown aspects of their identity. "Like for money? Playing piano for people?" "For money, for audiences, for recordings. I went to music school, performed in competitions, auditioned for orchestras and symphony positions. Marcus paused, watching his daughter process this information. I was good enough that some people thought I might make a career out of it. What happened? Sophia asked, her homework completely forgotten as she leaned forward with intense curiosity. Marcus considered how much truth an 8-year-old could handle, how to explain the complex interplay of tragedy and responsibility that had reshaped his life without burdening her with inappropriate emotional weight. Your mother died when you were born, and suddenly I had to make choices about what was most important. Taking care of you became my first priority, and everything else had to fit around that. Sophia absorbed this explanation with the solemn attention she reserved for serious conversations. But you could still play piano and take care of me, couldn't you? I take piano lessons at school, and Mrs. Martinez takes care of her kids, too. The logic was irrefutable and devastating in its simplicity. From Sophia's perspective, there was no reason why her father couldn't pursue his musical gifts while maintaining his responsibilities as a parent. The either-or framework that had governed Marcus's thinking for 3 years suddenly seemed less like practical necessity and more like self-imposed limitation. You're absolutely right, Marcus said quietly. And that's actually what I want to talk to you about. He began to describe the events of the past week, starting with Timothy's sleepless night and continuing through Dr. Hartman's visit and the extraordinary offer from Julliard. He watched Sophia's face as he explained the possibility of music therapy training, the chance to combine his musical abilities with work that could help sick children, the opportunity to build a career around talents he had almost forgotten he possessed. Sophia listened with the intense focus she brought to complex problems, asking occasional questions but mostly absorbing the information with the same methodical approach she used for challenging school assignments. When Marcus finished his explanation, she sat quietly for several moments, clearly processing the implications of what she had heard. So you would still work at the hospital, she said finally, but instead of cleaning floors, you would play piano for sick kids? That's part of it. I would also learn how to use music to help people feel better, to cope with being scared or in pain. It would require going back to school, but mostly through computer classes and occasional trips to New York. And I could take music lessons from the same school? Marcus smiled at her practical focus on the benefits that would accrue to her own musical education. That's what Dr. Hartman suggested. If you're interested in learning more about music, they have programs designed specifically for children. Sophia nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question that Marcus had been dreading. Would we have to move? Would I have to change schools and leave my friends? No, Marcus said firmly. We would stay right here in this apartment. You would keep going to your same school, playing with the same friends, living the same life we've built together. The only difference would be that I would be doing work that uses more of my abilities. Relief flooded Sophia's features, followed quickly by excitement as the full implications of the opportunity began to register. Could I hear you play sometime? I mean really play, not just a little? Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he realized how much his daughter had been missing by his decision to hide this part of himself. Would you like that? Yes, Sophia said without hesitation. I want to hear what my dad sounds like when he's being a real musician. Marcus looked around their modest apartment, taking in the second-hand furniture and carefully managed budget that had defined their life together. In the corner sat an old electronic keyboard that Sophia used for her beginning piano lessons, its plastic keys and tinny sound a pale echo of the acoustic instruments he had once called home. But it would have to serve for this moment of revelation, this crossing of the bridge between his hidden past and their shared future. He pulled the keyboard from its corner and set it up on the coffee table, adjusting its height so that he could play comfortably from the couch. Sophia curled up beside him, her eyes bright with anticipation and curiosity. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been preparing to leave, quietly settled into the armchair to witness what she sensed would be an important moment in the Rivera family history. Marcus placed his hands on the keys and felt the familiar sensation of coming home after a long journey. The keyboard's touch was different from the acoustic pianos he preferred, more mechanical and less responsive, but his muscle memory adapted automatically to its limitations. He began with something simple and beautiful, a piece by Debussy that had been one of Anna's favorites, music that captured the delicate interplay between melancholy and hope that had characterized their relationship. As the melody filled their small living room, Marcus watched Sophia's face transform with wonder and recognition. This was her father's true voice, the sound of abilities that had been hidden but never truly lost. The music seemed to expand the space around them, making their modest apartment feel larger and more significant, connected to a world of beauty and possibility that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Sophia listened with the focused attention of someone discovering a fundamental truth about reality. The way children responded when adults revealed hidden dimensions of the world they thought they already understood. When the piece ended, she reached out tentatively to touch the keys herself, as if the instrument might contain some residual magic from her father's performance. "That was beautiful," she said softly. "Why haven't you played for me before?" The question was innocent, but devastating in its directness, forcing Marcus to confront the ways that fear had robbed both of them of experiences that could have enriched their lives together. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that music would remind me too much of losing your mother. Afraid that it would make me want things I couldn't have while still taking proper care of you." Sophia considered this explanation with the seriousness she brought to adult conversations. "But music doesn't take care away from people," she said. "It gives more care. Like when I'm sad and I make up songs, I feel better, not worse." The observation was profound in its simplicity, cutting through years of complicated reasoning to identify the essential truth that Marcus had lost sight of. Music wasn't a competing obligation that threatened his ability to parent effectively. It was a tool for creating connection and providing comfort that could enhance rather than diminish his capacity for caregiving. "You're right," Marcus said, pulling Sophia closer to him on the couch. "And that's exactly why I think we should accept Dr. Hartman's offer." Over the next hour, they discussed the practical details of how the music therapy program would work, the ways it would change their daily routine, and the opportunities it might create for both of them. Sophia asked intelligent questions about the difference between performing music and using music for healing, about whether Marcus would have to wear different clothes for his new job, about whether she would be able to visit the hospital and meet some of the children he would be working with. Mrs. Rodriguez listened to this conversation with the warm satisfaction of someone who had watched a family discover new dimensions of their own potential. She had lived in the apartment next door for 15 years, had observed Marcus's transformation from aspiring musician to grieving widower to dedicated single father. Now she was witnessing his evolution into something that integrated all of these identities, a synthesis that honored both his gifts and his responsibilities. "Mijo," she said as she prepared to leave, "your Anna would be very proud of what you're choosing to do." "Ri." The comment brought tears to Marcus's eyes, not from sadness, but from the recognition that his decision felt aligned with values that he and Anna had shared during their brief but profound marriage. She had always believed that his musical abilities were meant to serve something larger than personal ambition, that his gifts carried obligations as well as opportunities. That evening, Marcus called Dr. Hartman to formally accept her offer, explaining that he had discussed the opportunity with Sophia and that both of them were excited about the possibilities it represented. Dr. Hartman sounded genuinely pleased by his decision, outlining the timeline for beginning the program and the steps required to transition from his current position to his new role as a music therapy specialist. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, covering everything from salary details to course schedules to the specific protocols he would need to learn for working with different types of patients. By the time Marcus hung up the phone, the abstract possibility of career transformation had become a concrete plan with deadlines and requirements and measurable outcomes. 3 weeks later, Marcus Rivera walked through the corridors of Children's Medical Center wearing a different uniform and carrying different equipment. Instead of a mop and cleaning cart, he now transported a portable keyboard and a collection of simple percussion instruments designed for use with pediatric patients. His new badge identified him as a music therapy specialist, a title that still felt surreal but increasingly natural as he settled into the rhythm of his transformed role. His first official patient was Timothy Chen, whose condition had stabilized enough to allow for regular therapy sessions, but who still faced months of treatment and uncertainty. The boy's face lit up when Marcus entered his room with the portable piano, and their collaboration had evolved into something that amazed even the medical staff who observed their sessions. Timothy had revealed a natural musical intelligence that went far beyond basic appreciation, demonstrating perfect pitch and an intuitive understanding of harmonic relationships that suggested significant untapped potential. Under Marcus's guidance, the boy had begun composing simple pieces that reflected his experiences with illness and recovery, musical expressions of courage and fear, and hope that provided outlets for emotions too. Complex for 8-year-old. Vocabulary. Dr. Chen had documented measurable improvements in Timothy's treatment, compliance and emotional regulation that she attributed directly to the music therapy sessions. The physicians throughout the hospital had begun requesting consultations, recognizing that Marcus's interventions were providing benefits that complemented and enhanced traditional medical care. The success of Timothy's case had led to rapid expansion of the music therapy program. Marcus now worked with patients throughout the hospital, from premature infants in the neonatal intensive care unit to adolescents facing cancer treatment to elderly patients in palliative care. Each population required different approaches and techniques, but the fundamental principle remained consistent. Music could provide comfort and connection that medicine alone couldn't offer. His online coursework with Julliard had begun 3 weeks into his new position, providing theoretical frameworks that helped him understand the mechanisms behind interventions he had been implementing intuitively. The combination of practical experience and academic learning was exactly what Dr. Hartman had envisioned, creating a feedback loop between real-world application and scholarly understanding that benefited both his patients and his professional development. Sophia had begun participating in Julliard's preparatory program through video lessons, with faculty members who were impressed by her natural musicality and rapid progress. Her electronic keyboard had been replaced by an acoustic upright piano donated by a grateful family whose daughter had benefited from Marcus's therapy sessions. The instrument dominated their small living room, but its presence felt appropriate rather than overwhelming, a symbol of music's central role in their newly reconfigured family life. 6 months after accepting Dr. Hartman's offer, Marcus received news that would complete his transformation from invisible hospital worker to recognized professional in his field. Dr. Hartman called with an offer that he had never dared to imagine: a full scholarship to complete his music therapy certification through an accelerated program designed for working professionals with exceptional ability and demonstrated impact. "Your work at Children's Medical Center has been extraordinary," Dr. Hartman explained during their video conference. "The outcomes you're achieving with pediatric patients are some of the best we've seen anywhere in the country. We want to fast-track your certification so that you can begin training other music therapists to replicate your methods." The scholarship would cover not only his remaining coursework, but also provide a stipend for living expenses and educational support for Sophia's continued musical education. More importantly, it represented formal recognition that his work had value beyond the immediate comfort he provided to individual patients. He was being invited to help shape the future of music therapy as a legitimate medical intervention. Marcus accepted the scholarship with the same mixture of excitement and trepidation that had characterized every major decision since Timothy's first sleepless night. But this time, the fear was balanced by confidence born from months of successful practice, evidence that his musical gifts could indeed be integrated with his responsibilities as a father and his desire to serve others. The ceremony announcing his scholarship took place in the hospital's main auditorium, attended by staff members who had witnessed his transformation and families who had benefited from his services. Timothy Chen, now in remission and regaining strength daily, performed a composition he had written with Marcus's guidance, his clear young voice carrying melodies that spoke of survival and resilience and hope. Sophia sat in the front row, wearing a dress that Mrs. Rodriguez had helped her choose for the occasion, and beaming with pride as her father received recognition for achievements she was only beginning to understand. At 8 years old, she couldn't fully grasp the significance of what was happening, but she understood that her father was being honored for using his gifts to help others, and that seemed like the most natural thing in the world. Dr. Chen spoke about the impact of music therapy on her son's recovery, describing Marcus not just as a skilled practitioner, but as a healer who understood that medicine extended beyond pharmaceutical interventions to include all forms of human comfort and connection. Her words were echoed by other physicians who had observed the way music could reduce anxiety, improve treatment compliance, and provide hope in situations where hope seemed impossible. Margaret Walsh, now serving as chair of the hospital's Music Therapy Advisory Committee, presented Marcus with a plaque recognizing his contributions to pediatric care and his role in establishing what was rapidly becoming a model program studied by hospitals throughout the region. But more meaningful than any formal recognition was the knowledge that his work was expanding opportunities for other musicians who wanted to combine artistic gifts with service to others. The program Marcus had pioneered was being replicated in hospitals across the country, with Julliard providing training and certification for music therapists who could bring similar interventions to patients who had never had access to such services. His success had demonstrated that music therapy wasn't a luxury for wealthy institutions, but an essential component of comprehensive healthcare that could be implemented anywhere with adequate training and institutional support. As the ceremony concluded and guests moved to a reception in the hospital lobby, Marcus found himself standing beside the piano where he had first played for Timothy 6 months earlier. The instrument had been tuned and refurbished, its sound now clear and resonant, capable of filling the entire pediatric wing with music when circumstances required. Timothy approached with his parents, walking steadily on legs that had regained strength through months of treatment and recovery. The boy who had once been too weak to sit up in bed was now healthy enough to attend school part-time and participate in activities that had seemed impossible during the darkest days of his illness. "Mr. Marcus," Timothy said, using the formal address that had evolved into an affectionate nickname, "will you play our song?" Marcus understood immediately which composition Timothy meant. Over the months of their collaboration, they had developed a musical piece that chronicled the boy's journey from fear through treatment to recovery. A musical autobiography that incorporated elements of classical technique with melodies that Timothy had hummed during their earliest sessions. Marcus sat at the piano and began the piece they had created together, music that started with hesitant, questioning phrases and gradually built toward confidence and resolution. Timothy stood beside the piano, adding his voice to certain passages and conducting imaginary orchestras during the crescendos, his face glowing with the particular joy that comes from seeing artistic creation brought to life. The informal performance drew the attention of everyone in the lobby, guests and staff members pausing their conversations to listen to music that told a story of healing more eloquently than any medical report could document. Children in wheelchairs and their families gathered around the piano, some joining in with humming or quiet singing, creating a spontaneous community chorus that transformed the clinical space into something approaching a concert hall. Sophia watched her father play with eyes that held new understanding of his identity and capabilities. Over the past 6 months, she had observed his transformation from exhausted night shift worker to energized healing professional, seen how the integration of his musical gifts with his caregiving instincts had created a version of himself that was more complete and authentic than anything she had previously known. As the final notes of Timothy's composition echoed through the lobby, Marcus felt the weight of profound gratitude settle around his shoulders. The journey from that first sleepless night to this moment of celebration had been filled with challenges and uncertainties, but it had ultimately led to a life that honored all aspects of his identity and aspirations. Dr. Hartman approached as the applause faded, her expression reflecting satisfaction with outcomes that had exceeded even her optimistic projections. "You've proven something important," she said quietly. "You've shown that exceptional musicians don't have to choose between artistic fulfillment and meaningful service to others. What you've built here is going to change lives for decades to come." Marcus nodded, understanding that his individual success was part of a larger transformation in how society understood the relationship between artistic gifts and practical contributions. The artificial boundaries that had once seemed to separate creative pursuits from essential services were proving more permeable than anyone had previously imagined. As the reception continued around him, Marcus thought about Anna and the conversations they had shared about music's role in a meaningful life. She had always insisted that his talents carried obligations as well as opportunities, that his abilities were meant to serve purposes larger than personal advancement or artistic recognition. The work he was now doing felt aligned with those values, an integration of gifts and service that would have made her proud. The program that had begun with one man playing piano for one sleepless child had evolved into a comprehensive music therapy initiative that served hundreds of patients annually and provided training opportunities for musicians throughout the region. Research studies were documenting outcomes that supported the expansion of similar programs nationwide, creating evidence-based justification for integrating music therapy into standard medical practice. But beyond the statistical measures and professional recognition, Marcus knew that the real success of his transformation lay in smaller, more personal victories. Children who found comfort in music during frightening medical procedures. Families who discovered new ways to connect during stressful hospitalizations. Young musicians who learned that their gifts could serve healing purposes as well as entertainment functions. Timothy Chen, now healthy enough to return to regular school and resume normal childhood activities, had become an advocate for music therapy programs, speaking to medical conferences and fundraising events about the impact that music had made on his recovery process. His compositions were being performed by other young patients facing similar challenges, creating a musical legacy that extended far beyond his individual experience. Dr. Chen had incorporated music therapy principles into her own medical practice, recognizing that patient care needed to address emotional and spiritual needs as well as physical symptoms. Her advocacy within the medical community had been instrumental in gaining acceptance for music therapy as a legitimate clinical intervention rather than merely a comfort measure. Margaret Walsh had used her influence to secure funding for music therapy programs at hospitals throughout the state, leveraging Marcus's success to argue for broader integration of artistic interventions into healthcare delivery systems. Her foundation now provided scholarships for musicians interested in pursuing therapy training, creating pathways for talented individuals who might not otherwise have access to such opportunities. As the evening concluded and guests began to leave, Marcus helped return the piano to its usual position in the pediatric wing. The instrument had become a fixture in the hospital's daily routine, its music providing comfort and connection for patients, families, and staff members who needed reminders that beauty could exist even in places dedicated to fighting disease and suffering. Sophia waited patiently as her father completed his responsibilities, understanding that his work extended beyond scheduled sessions to include all the informal moments when music could provide unexpected healing. She had learned to see their family life as part of a larger mission that included everyone who benefited from her father's gifts. And that perspective had made her feel proud and purposeful in ways that complemented her own developing musical abilities. The drive home took them through familiar neighborhoods that looked different now, not because the physical landscape had changed, but because their relationship to their community had been transformed. Marcus was no longer an invisible night shift worker, but a recognized professional whose contributions were valued and celebrated. Sophia was no longer just the daughter of a hospital cleaner, but the child of a musician healer whose work made a difference in the lives of families facing their most difficult challenges. Their apartment, once a retreat from the demands of a difficult world, had become a creative workspace where Marcus prepared for therapy sessions and Sophia practiced pieces that connected her to the larger musical community she was beginning to understand as her heritage. The upright piano dominated their living room, not as an intrusion, but as a symbol of music's central role in their reconfigured family identity. That night, as Marcus tucked Sophia into bed, she asked the question that had been building throughout the evening's celebrations. "Dad, do you think Mom would be happy about what you're doing now?" Marcus considered the question carefully, thinking about Anna's unwavering belief in the importance of using one's gifts in service to others. "I think she would be proud that we found a way to honor both our responsibilities and our dreams. She always said that the best life was one where you didn't have to choose between caring for others and being true to yourself." Sophia nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose understanding of the world had been confirmed rather than challenged. "I want to help sick kids with music too when I grow up." "Then that's what we'll work toward," Marcus promised. "Music is big enough to hold all of our dreams." As Sophia drifted off to sleep, Marcus sat at their piano and played quietly. Melodies that seemed to emerge from the intersection of gratitude and anticipation, acknowledgement of how far they had traveled, and excitement about the journey that lay ahead. The music that filled their small apartment was the same language he had discovered during Timothy's first sleepless night, but it had evolved into something richer and more complex, informed by months of experience and deepened by the recognition that his gifts were meant to be shared rather than hidden. Outside their window, the city continued its nightly rhythm of activity and rest, problems and solutions, suffering and healing. But inside their home, Marcus Rivera played music that spoke of possibility and hope, melodies that carried the promise that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to transform fear into comfort, isolation into connection, and hidden gifts into healing power. The scholarship ceremony had marked not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a new chapter in which Marcus would help train other musicians to discover the healing potential of their own artistic abilities. His story would become part of the larger narrative of music therapy's development as a recognized medical intervention, proof that extraordinary outcomes could emerge from the intersection of talent, compassion, and willingness to serve something larger than personal ambition. But the most important legacy of his transformation would be measured not in professional recognition or institutional change, but in the lives of individual patients who found comfort in music during their darkest hours, families who discovered new sources of strength and connection, and young musicians who learned that their gifts could serve healing purposes as profound as any traditional medical intervention. Timothy Chen slept peacefully in his own bed that night, his room filled with the silence that comes after successful treatment and the promise of full recovery. But in his dreams, he heard melodies that reminded him of courage and resilience, musical compositions that had helped him survive the most frightening period of his young life and emerge stronger and more compassionate than he had been before. Marcus Rivera, former hospital cleaner and current music therapy specialist, played until his own fatigue finally claimed him, his hands coming to rest on keys that had become as familiar as breathing, as essential as hope itself. The future stretched ahead of them, filled with challenges and opportunities they couldn't yet imagine, but grounded in the certainty that music would guide them toward whatever healing the world needed them to provide. In hospitals across the country, other musicians were beginning their own journeys toward careers that integrated artistic gifts with service to others. Inspired by programs that had proven such integration was not only possible but essential for comprehensive healthcare delivery. The revolution that had begun with one man playing piano for one sleepless child was expanding into a movement that would transform how society understood the relationship between art and healing. Creativity and compassion. The scholarship from Julliard represented more than individual achievement. It was recognition that the highest forms of musical artistry could be expressed through service to others, that technical excellence and emotional intelligence could combine to create interventions more powerful than either could achieve alone. Marcus's success had demonstrated that exceptional musicians didn't have to choose between artistic fulfillment and practical contribution to society's most pressing needs. Years later, when music therapy had become a standard component of pediatric healthcare and Marcus had trained hundreds of other practitioners in techniques he had pioneered, he would still remember that first night when Timothy Chen couldn't sleep and asked for something brave. The memory would remind him that the most important healing often began with the simplest gestures of human compassion, and that music's greatest power lay not in its complexity, but in its ability to connect one heart to another across the artificial boundaries that usually kept people apart. But that was still in the future. Tonight, Marcus Rivera simply played piano in his small apartment, creating melodies that carried his gratitude for second chances and unexpected opportunities, his love for the daughter who had given his life meaning and purpose, and his commitment to using whatever gifts he possessed in service to those who needed healing most desperately. The music that filled their home was the sound of a dream, realized not through abandoning responsibility, but by discovering ways to transform limitation into possibility, fear into hope, and hidden talents into visible contributions to the world's ongoing need for comfort and connection. It was the music of a life lived fully, honestly, and in service to something larger than personal ambition or individual success. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, new opportunities to discover what music could accomplish when guided by wisdom and compassion. But tonight was for gratitude, for recognition of how far they had traveled from that first moment when an 8-year-old boy asked for something brave and a hospital cleaner remembered that he was also a musician. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.